So I'm reflecting upon my father and my mother's recalling of the event. They reflected upon being kicked out of the country pretty early on in August. So it's towards the later end of August, but one of the earlier members of the Ugandan Asian community to leave. And my father says obviously it was an extremely hurried departure. Idi Amin was quite unstable and could do anything in terms of people coming into homes, attacking women, attacking property was pretty much pervasive throughout the Ugandan Asian community at that time. So there was a sense of fear that had pervaded the community in general, and they felt it. The speed and departure was something that came through. They had to leave hurriedly and quickly. The other thing that he and my father and my mother both said was that as they were leaving, they were effectively robbed on the way in their departure. So they were robbed, items were taken from them. And then my father was strip searched at the airport by Ugandan soldiers, and he always reflects and recounted to me this story. Then I was a year and a half, and my mother was holding me, but he recounted how he had 5 Ugandan shillings in his pocket, and there was a bottle of milk that he was holding, and so they clearly said a bottle of milk's fine, but when they strip searched him, they took out the last 5 shillings he had, and he was a pretty proud man who was at that time an electrical engineer in Uganda, so creating a lot of the electrical substations and design of electrical distribution in Uganda, so quite a senior role. So they kind of took away every single penny from my father and my mother and just left us with the clothes we were on and effectively the bottle of milk. That's what we left Uganda with. Amin was not a unique character. Leaders only come to the forefront if the environment creates them to come to the forefront. So however much Uganda may want to put past the legacy of Amin, black Ugandan Africans didn't really trust Asians, and Ugandan Asians didn't really trust black African Ugandans. Right? It's the unsaid thing. And Amin was part of the discourse going around in Uganda, which created or gave him the environment to come to the forefront, in addition to Britain's bloody involvement in putting Amin into those positions. Okay, so this country has a lot to answer for, because this country gave him the military positions, and this country pushed Amin forward, and this country effectively thought he was the one they could work and do dealings with, and he turned on them. Okay, so Britain has a responsibility, and it took some responsibility by taking the Ugandan Asians. But let's also be honest that Britain didn't open its arms to us and say, immediately come in, okay? It took public pressure to get them to take us in. So, yeah, they did the right thing in the end, but Britain's involvement in Uganda has a dirty history. The experiences of my family, I think, are quite different. Let me explain that. So my father, who was born in Pakistan, and again there was a colonial legacy in Pakistan which was left over, right? So he was drawn to Britain, and he came and studied in Britain. He did his degree here in Britain. And he then worked here in the UK. So he was there about 6 years. So he was quite adept and had lived in the UK and had studied in the UK, and then went and worked, got a contract in Uganda. My mother had been born in Uganda, and she was second generation born in Uganda. Her father had come as part of the British colonial legacy to come and work in Uganda around 1920. And he'd come to work, I think, as part of the naval or trade elements attached to the naval trade that was taking place around East Africa. So he came in early in 1919, 1920. My mother was born in Uganda, 1941, I think. So They met in Uganda. So my father had already kind of had a tradition of being engaged with British life. So it wasn't a culture shock to come to Britain. But there is something that is unsaid here, and it's something that is difficult, and it's an unsaid and it's a difficult thing. Again, there is a legacy in Uganda and in Kenya and East Africa, particularly in East Africa, that the colonial legacy was one based upon race. And so the Ugandan Asians were the administrative functions within the area. They were good at business. They were very good at, the administrative functions and entrepreneurial in Uganda. But in a way, there was a sense that whatever was white and British was excellent. Whatever was black and African wasn't so good. That was just permeating through, right? So when they came back, there was a sense that actually whatever was white and British was good. So there was a sense that actually you had to work harder to be accepted into the process of the country. And that was carried, I think, with my parents. And so it wasn't so much a culture shock, but there was more of a racial sense of wanting to integrate. And obviously there was never going to be a racial integration in the 1970s when you're just arriving, when Enoch Powell is really at the height of his strength. So I guess what I'm saying is there was always a need for acceptance from my parents, but my father was one who said, well, I'm going back to Africa, and took us back to Africa. So there is a sense, I suspect, given for what my family went through, of a need for acceptance, but actually a lot of Ugandan Asians probably finding rejection in the employment market, in discrimination, but acceptance in the volunteers who helped them in the camp. So kind of a double-edged sword. Does that make sense? A lot of volunteers helping, great. This is really good. We feel accepted. You go for a job or you try to get into the employment market and you're suddenly finding discrimination. You're going, well, what's this about? This is really weird. So there are probably multiple pulls going on with the population at that time. So in a way, the dislocation from Uganda, let me go back to that, was a dislocation from a sense of community. It's very strong. There was a very strong sense of community that came through what my mother said and my father said. So first of all, it was a sense of dislocation from community. It was a community pretty clearly that didn't have a sense of sectarianism around it. But you find, actually, if you look at the Asian community in the UK, it has a strong sense of sectarianism which has kind of permeated over the last 2-3 decades. So we as Ugandan Asians didn't have a sense of sectarianism. Actually, we had a sense of we had a collective identity which transcended religion and to some degree transcended race, even though there was a colonial legacy left over by the British colonial powers, which was based on race, okay? The unsaid thing, which was based on race. So we lost that sense of collectiveness by coming here. That's gone. The sense also of fear and the sense of fear of being kicked out in that scenario, I think, stayed with my mother. She carried that throughout her life. She really carried that. So, am I safe? Is somebody going to come in my house? Are we totally safe? She only felt that in the last 10, 15 years of her life. She died last year, but she only felt that in the last 10, 15 years of her life. Before that, she was always worried about security. She'd check her locks all the time, and I knew that was coming back from the time of Uganda and the sense of fear that had permeated into her. So my mother became quite fearful throughout her life, actually. And that fear gets generated into kids. It's the fear that you see in refugees, right? The trauma in refugees. The trauma goes straight through generations. So if there's a fearful event that takes place, like refugees in Ukraine, it goes into the next generation, just gets carried through unless there's work done. So my mother transcended that fear, kind of projected it straight into us as kids. And I feel that sometimes, but I can manage it. But the impact of that has been a generational trauma. The sense of trauma and dislocation is something not talked about within the Ugandan Asian experience. It's an experience which is talked about by some people who are very wealthy. That wealth is something they've been successful with, which is great. There's a lot of talk about, well, it was the right thing that happened in the end to some in the Ugandan Asian community. They found their peace in the UK. But that's not the full story. What's drastically missing in this whole arena, and I've raised this and I continue to raise this, is the fact that actually there has been an emotional trauma that is carried by refugees that is not talked about. So that emotional trauma, that sense of dislocation I've carried with me, even though I've lived in the UK 41 years now, I can wake up on any day and think, actually, I could leave the UK tomorrow. So I do feel a sense of rootedness, but I also don't feel a sense of rootedness. And that comes from a sense of dislocation, actually. Uganda has given me the ability to learn to adapt. Because we had to learn to adapt and adapt quickly. We didn't have time. We were just thrown in the situation, and we learned that. And I guess also my parents kept saying that. You know, they were pretty much like survivors. You get there, you get to a country, and you adapt. Like other Ugandan Asians, you get on with it. You have to live. You know, so the flexibility of mindset, I think, and the flexibility of being able to overcome obstacles is one of the outcomes of the trauma of dislocation from Uganda. There was a strong feeling of unsafeness that my parents had throughout their lives after Uganda. After Uganda, my father was okay, but my mother was pretty paranoid about security. She carried that all the time. And I guess the sense of fear that my mother has had, has, I think, been, in a way, projected into me. So there is a part of me that feels very willing to fight for my identity. I think it created a mistrust of Africa in me, which is really sad because I was born in Uganda. I was born in a place called Fort Portal, just on the eastern side of Uganda. But I've gone to Africa, and I enjoy Africa, but there's always been a mistrust of the security of Africa. And when I go to an African country, I'm like, am I safe? Am I safe? So there's a sense that I'm carrying a legacy, which is sad, because I'm never quite feeling safe in the continent. So the kind of work I've done has been in the heart of communities. And I think what happened to me in Uganda and what happened to me in Kenya, and again, we had to leave in Kenya, I've ended up in this work because of those incidences and events. So my work in communities really has been around social cohesion, bringing communities together. So that resonates very closely with what I said about Uganda, right? Why would that happen? And the fact is, I suspect it comes down to, so I've kind of closed a loop. So, that's what I've worked to try to bring communities together. And some of the work I've done really has been around kind of hate crime monitoring, around racist hate. Where did that come from? A little bit of the legacy of Uganda, right? So I've kind of lived out my experiences subconsciously, and they've come out in my professional career, my professional life. So yes, what I've done, I can clearly link back to my experiences. It's chalk and cheese going from Uganda and Kenya, Uganda, for example, to the UK. Not only a different look, a different race of people, a different culture, a different background, but the whole environment is completely different. And so, part of it has been learning to live with the difference in the legacy of the move. Do I feel visually and emotionally at ease with the UK? It's taken me a long time. I think it's really important to mark the 50th anniversary because, it's part of the cultural history of our country. Okay, it's part of the migration and sets of migrations that have taken place that make this country what it is. All right, so I think it's really important to mark that. I think it's also important to mark, specific and unique to this project, the way that society came together to help people to be resettled in the camps. And I think that's really important in the specificity of what this project's doing. But I also want to say the 50th anniversary should give us an opportunity to reflect on how it is still so difficult for refugees to actually enter the UK. It was easier for us compared to what it is today. You would think after 2-3 decades, 4 or 5 decades, we would make it easier for people to seek sanctuary with us, but we're making it much, much harder.
for them to get sanctuary with us?
I think there are lessons that the 72 settlement could teach us now. I think the community mobilization we have seen reflected in the Ukraine crisis. But I think the government was much more empathic and much more fluid and willing to work with communities quicker, with less bureaucracy and more connectedness in 1972 than today. And I think the bureaucracy, the sense that security overrides asylum. So let's check your background. Have you got a bill when people are running away from Ukraine? Is ludicrous. So it's more about looking at refugees through securitization of the country rather than the empathy that we as Ugandan Asians in the end got, right? You know, you can't deny that. What happened in Uganda have lived with me for 50 years. The impacts of what's happening in Ukraine will live with this country for decades to come unless we take some of the approach we took to Ugandan Asians. We settle them in. We integrate them in quickly. We open up our systems of support for them. But I don't see that happening from a government level. I see that happening from a community level in this country. And it's sad because the government is lagging.